Friends, please turn with me to Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 8. Exodus chapter 20. Say a quick word before we read the passage. We're going to look at a topic that is somewhat difficult or controversial in the Christian church nowadays. And so I had a choice. Whether to navigate a middle-of-the-road sermon that wouldn't offend anyone, or to preach from my personal convictions and the convictions of I would say Presbyterian churches, but really most Protestant churches for most of its history. And allow you from that to think, to meditate, and to consider how to apply this to your life. If you're not fully persuaded with all the application from this passage, that's all right. That's not a problem. We will not kick you out of the church or anything like that. It's all right. But I think it's much more interesting and enriching for me to preach from what I believe the passage is really saying, and to allow you to process that, think about that, and see how the Lord is applying this passage to your heart, if that makes sense. So if you're not fully persuaded, don't worry, don't be offended. We're not after you. But I want you to consider what I think the passage is truly saying here. So let's begin in Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 8 to 11. San Marcos, hear the word of the Lord. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And please now turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning in verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. San Marcos, the grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever. Amen. So we begin with a command, right? The command that comes, the fourth commandment from God. And we see it, for example, in Exodus 20, beginning in verse 8 there, where it says, remember the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy, it's observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, set it apart, set it as a special day. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you and your son or your daughter, your male servant, etc., we could say. God gives Israel this command to rest. It fundamentally is about ceasing from a normal day-to-day labor, right? We would say your Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 work. That's the simple, most foundational way in which God is speaking about the need to rest. Remember, always keep in your mind the context. God is speaking to people who have been slaves for hundreds of years. And think about what it means suddenly to get a command, which is there's a day in which you need to stop working, a day in which you need to stop your labor. It's tremendous. And this command is directed to what we would now call heads of households, right? If you notice, it says, your daughters and your servants and your oxen, right? It's speaking to the heads of household in a sense, saying you need to make sure that this Sabbath rest, okay, this rest is happening right through your family. Now, again, directed to slaves. this is an incredible call to rest. It's really an act of grace. Yeah, yes, it's a commandment, but it's also grace. That's why the extreme dividing line between law and grace needs to be thought about very carefully. It's a little bit like if you have someone who works in your company and this person's a workaholic and they go 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 and years go by and they're not taking a holiday and they're going and they're going and they're going, but they're messing up their lives and they're ruining their family life and they're working and working and working, and their boss says, you need to go on a vacation right now. You're going on a vacation. The guy says, no, I gotta work. And his boss says, you go on a vacation or you're fired. In a sense, it's a commandment, it's a threat, but really it's an act of grace. It's an act of helping and serving and caring for this person who is working themselves to death. So it's fundamentally about ceasing from labor, but very quickly, if you keep reading through Exodus and into Leviticus and into Numbers, it begins to get tied into the practice of tabernacle originally and then temple worship. It gets tied into the people's practice and habits and cycles of worship. Whether they're counting the festivals by the amounts of Sabbaths and new moons, or simply because on the Sabbaths there were certain types of sacrifices that needed to be offered, but there is very quickly a connection that begins to happen between rest and worship. Rest and worship. And I don't think it's just, these things happen to coincide at the same time, in the same space, if you will. I think that there's a connection because what is really happening is God is preparing and teaching his people that we need to rest on several levels. There are several layers of rest. We need to physically rest so that we can emotionally, spiritually rest. That rest in the Sabbath is more than just stopping from using a hammer, or in our case, maybe being in front of a computer with an Excel sheet. That rest is about peace, balance, satisfaction. What a lot of us are looking for in yoga, right, or maybe therapy. God is saying you need rest. You need to physically stop from working, but you need rest so that you can rest. I mean for real. I mean capital R, rest. There's a reason why St. Augustine in the 4th century takes this language of rest, right? And we've quoted this several times, but Augustine speaks of the fact that we've been created to have fellowship with God, worship, right? Communion, relationship, friendship with God. And he says we're designed for this, but we run after a million different other things trying to find that which we were only meant to find by having this fellowship with God. We were created, we were designed to find this in God, but we look for it in other things, and therefore our hearts are restless. Restless until they find their rest in you. Now, what a better description for our time than restless. Restless. I mean, it just doesn't stop, does it? Life just doesn't stop, ever. It never stops. And what happens when life never stops is that life is continually about yourself. And life is continually about what you need to achieve, what you need to accomplish, what you need to do. Now, there's nothing wrong with work. There's nothing wrong with accomplishments. There's nothing wrong with goals. But life becomes all about that. Where we become used to presidents tweeting at 3 a.m. and reactions that are immediate at 3:02 a.m. Where everything is nonstop and continual. Where the phone is buzzing at 2 in the morning and waking us up because the light is hitting us and disrupting our sleep patterns. And God is like that boss that says, take a vacation or you're fired. Rest. Rest. What are the reasons for rest? What are the reasons that he gives us for rest? Well, we begin in creation, actually. We begin in creation. We see this creation mandate referenced in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11 at the end. God says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth." We reference back to Genesis 1. "In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore," this is the reason why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, made it different. He set it apart from the cycle. And God, so we're told that God made the universe in 6 days and rested. And the point, Moses, God is not saying that on the seventh day God went, "That was hard work making the universe. I need to take a step back and chill on the couch and catch up on some TV, on some Netflix." That's not what Moses is saying. Right? We see this often throughout the Bible, but particularly in the Old Testament, we see what is theologically known as the language of accommodation. God accommodates his language to our understanding. There are things about God, just about everything about God, that is so mysterious, it's so transcendent, it's so different that we can't understand it. We don't understand it. And so God speaks to us in a language that we can understand. It doesn't mean that he lies to us and distorts the truth. He speaks the truth in categories that we can manage. We do this all the time. If you're a parent, you do this hopefully all the time with your child. You're not lying to your child. I'm thinking of a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. But you speak to them, you don't speak to them like you would speak giving a talk at a university or at a business meeting, right? You speak to them in language that they can understand, and you're giving them the information that they can handle at the age at which they're at. And then when they're not 4 but 14, you can speak to them about the same things at a deeper level, and so on and so forth. God does the same thing with us. He's a father who speaks to his children, who stoops down, as it were, to allow us and speaks to us in a way that we can understand. But what he's saying is God made the world, and this world had the Greek word is a telos. It had a purpose. It had a goal. It was moving towards something. Life is not cyclical, is the point. Most of our worldviews in this world are, the world in history is just cyclical. It goes over and over and over again, and the patterns just repeat and repeat and repeat, and there's no end point, there's no goal, there's no purpose. It just goes round and round and round and round and round. The biblical worldview is history moves in a direction, and the direction is peace, satisfaction, joy, delight, rest, capital R, rest. You see what I'm saying? It's work and effort, which are good things that work exists before the fall. These things are not ends in of themselves. They move towards joy, peace, balance, satisfaction. Okay, so that's what it is. It's metaphorical language, but it's the idea that things are moving towards a goal. And it's interesting that right as soon as man and woman are created, on the sixth day, the seventh day happens. And the idea there, when you look at Genesis 2, and in a sense it's reiterated here in Exodus, is that men and women are created as the pinnacle of God's creation. They're the only creation that are the image of God, that reflects something about what God is like. And then God, and as it were, the seventh day happens and God rests. And if God rests and man and woman are made in the image of God, that is, they are meant to reflect God out into the world. They're meant to in a sense, at a small scale, replicate and repeat and pattern themselves after God. The point is, they are to rest with God on that seventh day. They are to rest with God because they are the image of God. They are the image of God. If God rests, then his children, his images, are to rest. This is before the fall. This is God's good design for the world. So there's a creational grounding to the Lord's Day. By the way, that's the reason why Jesus says that marriage is not abolished in the New Covenant. It's grounded in creation. It's a creational thing. It's not something that happens later on that God is improvising in history. It's grounded in the very creation that God brings man and woman together in marriage. And in creation, God sets a pattern for time where there is work, but there's also rest. And it's part of the way the world is meant to function. So God, through Moses, tells them, rest, because you were created to work hard, not be lazy, work hard, but rest. To enjoy one another, enjoy the world God created and enjoy God himself in fellowship and communion. You're no longer slaves. You're now to find it one day in 7 to rest. But the interesting thing is that's not the only reason. So God gives them this command. Israel goes through all of their experiences through the desert, the good, the bad, and the very ugly, right? They're wandering for 40 years. A whole generation dies out. A new generation emerges. They're about to enter the land, Deuteronomy, right? The Deuteronomos, the repetition of the law. They're about to enter the land. Moses repeats the law to this new generation of Israelites. And in Deuteronomy 5, Moses says that one of the reasons God has established or gave him the commandment to observe a day of rest, the Sabbath, on the 7th day was redemption, was salvation. We read in Deuteronomy 5:15, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." This is fascinating. They're told to keep the Sabbath day because there's a creational pattern, yes. But they're told that the Sabbath day is a day in which they are meant to remember the time in which they were slaves, where they were burdened and they toiled, and how God liberated them, freed them from this experience. Many of you celebrated the 4th of July this week. For those of us from a British background, that has a very different connotation, but we won't go into that. It's a day of mourning, but it's okay. No, many of you celebrated the 4th of July, as you rightly should, and for many of you, I don't know if all of you in Chile were able to do so, but for many of you it's time to take a day off, to have fireworks, to have barbecues, to just chill, to enjoy your family, and to celebrate. But at least in theory, at least partly, it's meant to be a time to remember that if you're an American, it's a time to remember that you are free and why you are free and the costs involved with you being a free country and to enjoy the freedoms that you do. It was a result of what others did for you in the past. So it's a time to relax. It's even a time to celebrate, to enjoy, to be happy, to be festive. But also it has a serious side to it where you're meant to remember how you're able to enjoy a barbecue. Why you're able to enjoy a barbecue in peace is because of what has happened in the past and what other people did, in a sense, for you in the past. And that's what's happening here in Deuteronomy 5. God is saying, you guys lived lives with no rest. You were burdened, you were burnt out, you were trapped, and then God came in and freed you and brought you out from there and is taking you now into the promised land out of grace and mercy. In salvation, God has given you rest. So during the Sabbath, during this day, you are to remember that. You are to celebrate that. You are to meditate on that fact. Who you are as a result of what God has done for you. So we see that those are the two main reasons why God tells them that he's giving them the Sabbath rest. There's a creational pattern, institution, and there is this redemptive, this salvation time of remembrance, of celebration, and of worship. And these two strands, the strand of creation and the strand, if you will, of salvation are strands that go through. There are these elements, these ideas that repeat and go right through the Old Testament into the New Testament, right through the Bible. And when we get to Jesus Christ, we really see the ultimate fulfillment of this theme of rest. And we see that really, when we get to the gospel, the rest, Sabbath is about the gospel, that the gospel is a gospel of rest. A gospel of rest. And that's our third point. And we see how, when we get to the gospels, when we get to the story of Jesus, we see how the Sabbath is fulfilled in Jesus, in the person and the work of Jesus. You see, when Jesus appears on the scene, he causes quite a stir regarding the Sabbath. He's a Jewish man. He begins to develop a following. People are going after him and following after him as part of his work and his ministry. And he allows people to pick grains and eat on the Sabbath day. Oof. Many religious leaders of the time saw this as a violation of the Sabbath. He heals a man on the Sabbath. The horror, right? Can't believe it. He is breaking the Sabbath. He's going against the commandments of God. Who is this upstart Jesus? And it's at this point where many contemporary authors and writers, and in fact, claim that Jesus, in light of the coming of Jesus, he brings a new understanding of the Sabbath, and therefore in the new covenant, the New Testament, this new stage in salvation history, believers in the church in the new covenant aren't required to obey the Sabbath. Jesus is our Sabbath, he is our rest, and so you can see that he disrupts and changes the meaning of Sabbath in the New Testament, and so we don't have to obey it anymore. Many will reference the fact that in the New Testament, the Sabbath commandment is the only commandment that seems not to be explicitly repeated. And those are good reasons. If that's where you are, that's an understandable position to take. But I want to tell you why I don't think that's what's happening, and I just want to give you some ideas. I think what Jesus is doing actually is drawing out the true, deeper, and ultimate meaning and a sense of Sabbath without obliterating it or abolishing it. What he's showing is that the Sabbath points to him, and that the Sabbath has a deeper significance with how it reveals and points to him and the truths and the principles of the gospel. For example, when we go to Mark 6, verse 27, we see this. After this dispute about Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath and all the uproar that this causes with the religious leaders, Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's important because he's not saying, now that I've come and I'm going to fulfill the meaning and the sense and the purpose of Sabbath, we're going to do away with it, and that's why I'm healing a man on the Sabbath. No, he says, I'm healing a man on the Sabbath because it was always for man. Sabbath was made for our sake, ultimately, and not particularly for God's sake. It is at the service of man. That's why it's not principally about law that we do to satisfy God, but about God's grace to us in a restless world. It's at our service. It's an act of grace. We saw that Sabbath was this creational mandate. It was about redemption. But Jesus is reminding us, guys, I healed a man on Sabbath because Sabbath was always about God healing us. I'm not doing something new. I'm doing what Sabbath was always meant to be. Sabbath was always meant to be about God's work in our life to heal us, at least in light of what we see in the gospel. So Jesus is basically, I want to suggest, telling us that Sabbath is grace. And if grace, then it's not abolished in the New Testament. If grace, it's heightened and reaffirmed and strengthened and deepened in the New Testament and in the New Covenant. Again, it's this boss telling you, take a break, go on vacation. I command you to rest. Additionally, right after that in Mark 6:28, Jesus says, so the Son of Man, that's a reference to himself, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And that's very important. It tells us that Jesus is the boss of the Sabbath. The Pharisees don't get to tell Jesus what the Sabbath is about. Jesus owns the Sabbath. Jesus is the boss of the Sabbath. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so Jesus, from Genesis forward, is the one who determines what the Sabbath is about, because the Son of Man is God himself. The Son of Man, Jesus, is Yahweh on earth as a man. And so Jesus is saying, I'm in charge of the day of rest. That's my business. I get to decide what it's about, and I get to decide how it's acted upon, how it's obeyed, and when it's obeyed, which is important, as we will see. So we see the Sabbath is fulfilled in Jesus, and I'll actually go deeper in that. But the Sabbath is also applied in Jesus. Applied in Jesus. We see the creational fulfillment, okay? We see how the creational strand of Sabbath, of rest, is fulfilled in Jesus. In that Jesus dies on the sixth day, on a Friday. His body rests, as it were, on the seventh day, on the Sabbath. And then he is risen, he rises, the resurrection happens on the first day of the week, on a Sunday. He rises with a new body, a body unaffected by the fall, a body that has the scars of the past, but it's a new body that is free. It is Paul calls it a spiritual body, which doesn't mean that it's ethereal and invisible, but that it's powered and pumped, in a sense, by the Spirit itself. It is a signpost of the new creation. I want you to understand this. God in the Bible promised, he creates the world. The world is a good place. The world is a place untouched by sin, death, evil, and sickness. It is a great place of harmony. It is a place of rest. And then there is the fall. Mankind rebels against God, and the world goes into disarray, chaos, conflict, pain, sin, and death. And then all of the story of the Bible is about God at work in the world and in the lives of his people to renew, to restore all of creation. Certainly his people, who are made in his image, but also all of the world. And the ultimate end of the story of the Bible is not that we get to float up to heaven into the clouds like these chubby babies that play on harps. That's not the goal of the Bible. The goal of the scriptures, of the story of redemption, is a new physical world that is greater and more glorious than Eden, and that exists because of what Jesus Christ has done for us. It's a real world with blades of grass, where there are meals. Revelation describes a meal where we eat and enjoy physical things, where I have no doubt there will be soccer games and certainly baseball games as well. It will be a place where we will enjoy real things. It's not an ethereal world. And do you know what was the first sign that that world was being brought about? Jesus' own body. Jesus' own body is the first part of the new creation. His body is already designed to live in that new reality that God has promised for us in the future. That's why Paul talks about him as the first fruit. He's like the seed of the full universal renewal. His body, his resurrected body, is that. It's a body that is free from death. It's broken free from death and cannot be touched by death again, or sickness, or any of these realities of the fall. And when Jesus rises on the first day, his own body is testimony that the new creation has begun. It hasn't begun for us now living in this world, but it has begun in Jesus. And when he returns, it will spread from Jesus out into all the universe. We will experience a resurrection in a new body, and the whole world will experience total and absolute renewal and freedom from the sin and the destruction that it's tied to today. That's the whole strand, that's the whole logic of the biblical story. And so that is why the gospel writers speak continually. If you read John, once Jesus is risen, it's on the first day of the week. On the first day of the week. On the first day of the week, they did this. On the first day of the week, Jesus appeared to who knows who. Then a week goes by, and again, on the first day of the week, they were praying, and Jesus shows up. And then the first, over and over and over and over and over and over again, the first day of the week, because Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, and he decides when Sabbath happens and how it happens. Creation was about work moving towards a goal. And on the seventh day, the end of the week, we reached rest, peace, and joy. But in the new covenant, Jesus stands and says, the work has been done, and I have done it. Come on into my rest. The Old Testament is moving towards rest, and in the New Covenant, our lives flow from the rest that Jesus Christ has accomplished for us in his death and his resurrection. But there's a salvation fulfillment. It's connected, obviously, to what we just said, which is that the first day of the week represents the moment in which Jesus fulfills his Exodus work. In the resurrection, what we see is the demonstration in power that Jesus has conquered sin, death, sickness. That these realities continue to exist for now, but death is dying. Death has been given its death blow. It still scratches and screams and snarls and tries to do its worst. But as Paul himself would later say, death, where is your sting? Because of what Jesus has done, for me, death is to be away from the body, is to be with the Lord. death loses its sting. It is the freedom, it is the moment where he gives a death blow to sin. We still struggle, if you've trusted in Jesus Christ, you still struggle with the reality of sin in your life. But what was that passage that Jeff read for us this morning from Romans 6? Sin no longer has dominion over you. You struggle with sin and the consequences of your sin, but there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And when he returns, he will free us from not only the dominion of sin, but from the very presence of sin. We are free from all this to belong to him. And therefore, Jesus calls on us to set this day apart, to remember him, and to delight in him, and to celebrate, like the 4th of July, celebrate the freedom that he has purchased for us on the cross and by his resurrection. Because what he's telling us is that we will ultimately find true rest when we find our rest in Jesus, the Lord of rest. The Lord of rest. In Exodus 33, just a few chapters after Exodus 20, right? Exodus 33, Yahweh, the Lord God, tells Moses, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then in Matthew 11, hundreds of years later, hundreds of years after Yahweh tells Moses, "I will give you rest because my presence will go with you." In Matthew 11:28, Jesus says to us, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Yahweh speaks to Moses, "I will go with you and I will give you rest." Jesus says to us, "Come to me, all those who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Jesus told us the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath. He gets to decide what day of rest is, what the day of rest is, and how to spend it. He rose on the first day of the week, and I believe he established it as the new day of rest for the new people of God. The Apostle John in Revelation 1 says that he sees the vision on the Lord's Day. And I think the Lord's Day is a reference taken from the Psalm where it speaks of those who rejected the rock, and the rock has become the cornerstone. It's a reference to Jesus and how religious leaders rejected Jesus as the rock, but Jesus, by being rejected, by dying on the cross, becomes the cornerstone, becomes the basis, the ground for God building a new people of God, right? The rock that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, Psalm 118. This is great and wonderful in our eyes. And then it says in Psalm 118, this is the word's doing. This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. The Apostle Paul, the Apostle John, a good Jew, when he says, "I saw this vision on the Lord's day," what day was he referring to? He's referring to the day in which the stone that the builders rejected became the cornerstone, because that is the day that the Lord made. It's the Lord's day. It's the Lord's day. That's why in Acts, over and over again, we see that they gathered together on the first day of the week. Paul arrives at a city. A whole week goes by, and on the first day of the week, he gathers together and preaches, and they celebrate the Lord's Supper. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, 11, 14, when he's discussing the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 14, he says, on the first day of the week, when you're gathered together, remember this, when you're at the Lord's table. And we read that over and over again. And it's interesting because Sundays were not a day off. This was not, 19th, 20th, 21st century, Western, the States, Canada, whatever it is. It would have been inconvenient and uncomfortable to meet on the first day of the week. So why didn't they just meet on a Wednesday night? But they didn't. You read the New Testament on the first day of the week, on the first day of the week, on the first day of the week. And that tells us that they considered it imperative, necessary. Ordinarily, there could be extraordinary circumstances, but ordinarily, the normal pattern was to meet on the first day of the week, besides the fact that they could meet on other moments throughout the week. So how do we apply the fourth commandment to ourselves as Christians? I think we should take Jesus at his word when he tells us to go to him to find rest for our souls. And you say, okay, Sam, that's nice, but how do I go to Jesus, as you say? How do I go to Jesus? I think there's a catechism called the Heidelberg Catechism that helps us a lot. It says that we should diligently attend the assembly of God's people, diligently, to learn what God's word teaches, to participate in the sacraments and the ordinances, to pray to God publicly, and to bring Christian offerings for the poor. We often see the time that we gather together as something that we do, hard work for God. And I think the biblical pattern and perspective is we gather together to sing, to pray, to hear his word, to participate at the table, or to baptize, to give offerings. And that is how we come close together to Jesus to experience from him the rest that we need for our souls. The Sabbath is not something that God created principally for himself. Sabbath was created to bless us. It's an act of grace from God that he calls us to gather together, even with those people that you find uncomfortable to hang out with, and they're kind of strange, and they speak funny, and they have these strange ideas from their denomination, and sit through Sam preaching on the fourth commandment for 30 minutes, and you have to sit there, and it's cold, and you're tired, you only slept 5 hours. It can feel like work. It can feel like you're doing something for God. But what God says is, no. When you gather together, when you have to put up with Sam for 30 minutes, when you have to sit with that person who annoys you, when you have to participate at the Lord's table, I am working a work of grace in your life. This is me saying, stop working and take a vacation. This is me saying, stop and find and go to Jesus Christ. Take hold of him, as it were, in prayer, at sermon, at the table, whatever it is, and get from Jesus that rest for your souls that you need. And that tells us a few things, and with this I'll draw to a close. First of all, it reminds us that resting is necessary. God created the Sabbath, created this pattern even before the fall, because he knows that we are finite creatures and we don't have an infinite supply of energy. We're not omnipotent, that is, unending power like God has. We are very, very much limited in our potency, in our power, in our strength. And we often live as if we have an endless supply of energy, that we can keep going and going and going and going. And God is saying, no, you are a creature. You have limits. And you are dependent on rest to keep going. It is God's way of reminding us where we are. We are not gods, even though we often think and act as if we were. We are creatures. We are finite. We are weak. And we are dependent. And God is teaching us that every time we stop from what we could do and make an effort to come together as God's people and celebrate the resurrection on the first day of the week. So he's telling us it's really a way in which God destroys the idols of success and work and self-reliance. And that's very important, self-reliance. You and I are very self-reliant. I can do this on my own. I can figure it out. I don't need anyone else. I can make it work. I can make this work in my life. I can work out this problem in my life. I can resolve this problem. I can keep going. I can keep working. I can do it. You can do it. And the Sabbath is an act of grace because God takes a big mallet, a big hammer, and destroys that idol. But it's hard for us to accept that. And God is saying, I want you to rely on me. I want you to trust in me. I want you to find the resources to make it through this hard life in me, in Jesus, and through the means of grace that he has provided. I want you to stop being the self-made man and recognize, or woman, and recognize that you are a God-made man, and therefore a God-dependent person. It also tells us that rest per se is not laziness. Now, notice the pattern. It's not 6 days of rest and 1 day of work, right? So the normal pattern and expectation from the Bible is we are to work hard. Okay, so do not take from the sermon, guys need to chillax and not work. The imperative of the scriptures is strongly against laziness, right? In the Proverbs, we have Proverbs against laziness. Yeah, Paul says the man who does not work is worse than an unbeliever. I mean, the Bible is very strong against laziness and encourages a strong, a dependable, a constant, a persistent work ethic. But what the Bible is saying is work cannot be your God. Work is good, but work is not a God. And by ceasing from working, that's also an act of faith, because we could keep working that day. We could do that extra thing that we need to do and send out that extra email. We could do it. And God's saying, trust me with your life. Trust me with your life. Now, this is just as an aside, it doesn't mean that there are particularly difficult periods of intense work. I'm talking about the normal pattern, okay, the normal pattern. The other thing it's telling us is resting is connected to worship. Resting. So it's good for you to have a day off, and maybe you have a day off that's other than Sunday. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But he's telling us that going out with your buddies and fishing every Sunday, I'm saying every Sunday, and saying, well, my fishing buddies are Christians, so this is church, and so we're hanging out, and this is, no. Worship. You need the means of grace. You need God's word. You need prayer. You need to do it every day. You need to do it in families. You need to do it throughout the week, certainly, but certainly particularly gathered together as God's people, as an assembly, in his presence, by the power of his Spirit, under his word. You need to do that as a normal pattern of life. There are moments of vacation. There are extreme, extraordinary circumstances, but your normal pattern should be this. And finally, resting is an act of gratitude. So because it's creation and salvation, we rest to remember God's salvation, to celebrate his salvation in Jesus Christ, to worship him, to hear his word. But it's good and right to go out and have lunch with your family, to invite friends over, I don't think it's wrong to toss a Frisbee on a Sunday, okay? There are places in the world where they'll chain down the swings, because, how dare a child swing on it? I don't think that's about it, because there's the creational aspect, thread, element in the Sabbath rest, which is about enjoying the good things that God has made us. This is a fallen world, but it is still, even fallen, a good world that God has given us that has good things that we can celebrate and enjoy. Good things that we can celebrate and enjoy. Having said that, may be an act of resting, of gratitude, of worship, and not another day to do something else for myself. Some of us struggle with ceasing from working on the Lord's Day. Some of us will struggle from keeping it from being continual days for golf, for fishing trips, for hiking trips, and I want to encourage you, I don't want to make a list of how many times and how many hours are right or wrong, but I want to encourage you, our normal pattern should be that this is a time to worship God, to have fellowship with other believers, to enjoy God's creation, to be thankful for all that he's done for us, and grateful for the world that he has placed us in during this time.